where does the FDA stand on this?
Well, I think, like lots of your listeners will be, it's quite surprising that MPs are not subject to these checks already. You would have thought people elected to Parliament, with the position that holds, with the access that gives you as an MP, would be subject to some of these basic checks. And many of my members who work with MPs, whether that's in Parliament or in the civil service, will have been subject to these checks as well for the reasons that you outlined in your introduction. So I think it seems like a bit of a no-brainer. I think what we need to think about is, well, what happens then? What happens when you've done a DBS check? Because if you're going for a job, I was DBS checked when I used to volunteer with a boys' football team.
Right.
So obviously the point of that is to screen people. If they fail a DBS check, then they would not be able to either get employment or volunteer, in my case, with a boys' football team for obvious reasons. So what happens if essentially an MP fails a DBS check? Is it just a matter of public record? Is it about risk management, that if there are reasons why they fail, then the parliamentary authorities can think about, well, what does that mean about the work of that MP, how that MP interacts with the public, how staff interact with that MP. So I think understanding the consequences of introducing a check is important as well, to think about how you would deal with it. But also, it's just extraordinary, as you say, that, political parties who essentially select MPs can make up their own rules and whether they subject them to DBS checks or not. And I think, in part, that's one of the reasons why this MP is doing this. If you get to Parliament, you have this standard, and it's kind of pushing political parties to try and do that in the first place.
I catch your... Okay, I get you. So in one sense, you're saying there's going to be nowhere to hide once you get into Parliament, so you might as well. Okay, because I was going to ask you, Dave, whether you felt that this is shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted, whether we should be looking at vetting candidates, the party's vetting candidates. Obviously, I can see it's increased costs, increased delays. But for me, I don't want to vote for someone with a criminal record.
Yeah, exactly. And you would think it would be in parties' own interests to do this. But as we've seen time and time again, parties act in quite often partisan and political ways on a whole range of issues on standards, where it's become politically difficult to deal with something. Then they simply kind of pass the buck. And one of the problems with standards when it comes to MPs is that MPs essentially control their own standards. Yes. So unless MPs themselves volunteer for a standards regime, it can't happen. Now, there are understandable reasons for some of that about the independence of Parliament, but I think what it's demonstrated in the past is that they can be quite reluctant at times as a group of MPs to impose a set of standards. It's taken a long time to get a proper complaints process within the parliamentary system, and I think this is also part of the modernisation culture that I think is taking place with so many new MPs coming in, saying we want to raise standards in Parliament. Parliament should be an exemplar. It's an employer at the end of the day.
Yes.
It employs thousands of people. People who are MPs should be subject to the same basic conditions that every employee is up and down the country if they do something wrong, or in this case, subject to a check as part of that employment process. And I think it's part of that general kind of let's improve the culture in Parliament. And there's a real opportunity to do that, I think, with so many new MPs.
I was just checking myself, because I said, if I wouldn't want to vote for an MP with a criminal conviction, but I want to qualify that and say, well, it would depend on what the candidate, if we went down that route, what the candidate had actually done, how long ago. So I just want to say I wouldn't necessarily not vote for someone who had a criminal record. And I guess unless it was decided otherwise, there would be no reason to stop anyone with a criminal record from standing. It would simply be that voters would know beforehand.
And Matthew, it may be the case that someone who's had a difficult and troubled background is the perfect sort of person to be an MP. Do you know what I mean? We want MPs to come from a very diverse background, not just a kind of privileged group. It's difficult to be an MP. It's a really tough job. And most MPs do it, just for all of the right reasons to serve their constituents. And you want an MP that's got life experience. That's why I think thinking about what are the consequences of these checks, whether that's done by parties or whether that's done by parliamentary authorities, is important as well. So that we wouldn't want to have a situation where essentially some people who have either made mistakes in the past or have had a troubled background but have got themselves out of that and become MPs are then kind of vilified in the press as a result of these DBS checks and could be subject to political attacks as a result of it.
I think we'd have to stick with probably the same rules we have at the moment. No bankrupts, no one who's done more than a year inside. Those would be barriers. I think anybody who was found that they had, sexual issues with children as a result of DBS checks, I don't think anybody would want that. But perhaps the existent rules, but with a check either, as is proposed by Joe Wright once someone's been elected to Parliament, or perhaps in advance of that. Dave Penman, lovely talking to you. I'm joined next by Dominic Headley, a government advisor, a former government advisor on criminal record policy. Good morning to you, Dominic.
Good morning, Matthew. How are you, sir?
I'm very well. I mean, I think many people might be surprised that so little checking is carried out on our MPs. The bit that really surprised me today, Dominic, is this also applies to partners and spouses.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, people would be very, very surprised that checks aren't done at the moment. I would clarify that lots of people are asked whether they have to whether they do have a criminal record. So there is generally a self-disclosure process in place for very many. It's just there's not a check to verify the information that an individual may have previously provided via self-disclosure. But I'm pretty much on the same page as Dave in many of the point your previous caller he made of saying, look, who's going to argue against bringing in checks that many of us would have to go through ourselves in our professions? But actually, what's the policy? What's the procedure? You do the checks and then what? What's your decision making to determine whether someone can or cannot do that job? That's what I'm interested in seeing within this proposal, to be honest, Matthew.
Just, I don't want to hang too much on the idea of spouses and partners, but are they asked by parties whether they've got anything to declare, or is it just the person who's standing for Parliament? Because it strikes me that it's a very vague, someone's partner. I mean, how long would you have known them for them to qualify as a partner? The idea that they're wandering around the Westminster estate with a free pass seems bizarre.
I think the issue here is, again, going to be how do we balance people's right to privacy, with being a risk or put in risk for the position that they're undertaking. And if somebody is, wandering freely through Parliament, isn't that an issue themselves, or are we saying that the other vetting or the security clearance checks that we don't know about are being undertaken, so there's less of an issue rather than just doing a criminal record check in itself through the DBS? Because that's a very, very complicated regime. And apart from anything else, it takes a lot of time for a DBS check to come through. And you've got to have practicality in place when you're having these procedures. If I'm due to visit for an event, Parliament in a couple of weeks, if every single body was carried out a DBS check to enter Parliament, then you'd probably have less events going on, to be honest.
Okay. Very interesting speaking to both you, Dominic, and Dave. I've got a much clearer picture. Hopefully the listeners have as well.